There's a point of interest for me. I'm not going to make it a big theological distinctive. That would be dumb and it would be wrong. But there is this, I'm just going to call it a point of interest where Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 23, stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Here is why I find this interesting. It's in the last three words, your frequent illnesses. Paul was a full-on apostle, and at certain times in his life and ministry, he had healed a lot of people. I think because what he did or didn't do in terms of healing is not the point of his ministry. The point of his ministry was to proclaim the gospel and gather people to Christ. Here's why I find this interesting. Could not Paul have said, Timothy, don't worry about it. I've prayed for you. You're going to get well. Because I think he could have. But he didn't. I wonder why. I don't have a good explanation or a good answer for that question, but it is a point of interest. And maybe today, one of the reasons that it's a point of interest for me is because my wife and I got word this morning that a dear friend of ours in Iowa is dying of cancer. It began as an ache and then a pain, and well, now it's invaded his entire body, including his brain. The end is near for him. Since it was first discovered that he had cancer, and this was months ago, we prayed and prayed and prayed for his healing. And for whatever reason, a reason that I don't understand and probably wouldn't be able to understand, God has not healed him. Does this mean that God didn't answer our prayer? Kind of. He did. No, he answered it, but his answer was no. This is hard for me. I don't like to be told no. And it's difficult because this guy, I can't see that he did anything to cause this. He's a wonderful, devoted follower of Christ. One of his gifts is helps and service, and the guy, he just did. You hardly even had to ask him for help. He just seemed to know and showed up. I don't get it. I won't ever, till I get on the other side of life, and at that point, I don't even think God will have to explain it. I'll be able to understand it. I'll get it. But in the meantime, his wife, daughter, granddaughter, it doesn't make sense. God doesn't always heal everybody that he is asked to heal. I don't know whether, I have to assume, and assuming is a dangerous thing, but I'm making an assumption on the basis of what we know about Paul. I think he would have been praying for Timothy. Evidently, if his prayer included, Lord, heal Timothy's frequent illnesses, if his request had included that, and I have no reason to believe that it wouldn't have, evidently God said no. All right. That's bunny rabbit trail. That's got a big deep hole at the end of it, so I'll back out. Verse 24. The sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. This is like a proverb. There's just a statement of fact. And it hardly needs any explanation. Some sins are obvious. But there are other sins that can be hidden. They can be covered. They can be undisclosed. But you know what? Sin is still sin. These obvious sins reach a place of judgment ahead of them. In my opinion, what that means is because they're obvious, people see it. Okay? And then the sins of others trail behind them, meaning you don't see them so much, but they're still there. They don't go away. They trail behind. The point is, sin will eventually catch up to you. We don't talk much about that in the church. I grew up in a church that talked about that almost nonstop, but they didn't talk about it in a redemptive way. They talked about it in order, in my opinion, in order to project guilt onto all of us and I think what they hoped for was that if they didn't let up on the guilt thing, we'd slide over into this bad behavior. And so they're going to lay the guilt on as a way of stopping us from going there. The problem is, it almost never stops people. What stops people, in my opinion, is the consequences of bad choices. And it only stops people if they are willing to lay aside their pride and hubris, their hard-headedness, and learn from the consequences of bad choices. Well, that takes a PhD to figure out. Well, no, it doesn't. Isn't that that's what's at the heart of good parenting? Good parents learn to discern what consequences should we permit to catch up to our kids. Because my thing is, on one level, I don't want my kids to break with God's design in sin. I don't want that. But a more realistic way of me saying it is, I want my kids to learn how to not sin. There's a difference. When they're little, I can keep them from all kinds of stuff. But as they get bigger, my ability to control them becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until usually by adolescence, you don't have very much control. Okay, that's a hobby horse of mine, so I probably should get off it. But then he follows it up in verse 25. In the same way, this is the other side of the coin. Good deeds are obvious. Well, yeah. He says, and even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever. Now, this is an encouraging word to Timothy and us. Do you ever feel like, I used to think, they never asked me at any conventions that I can remember to lead a workshop for adults. I did have the privilege of doing some teaching for adults with Christ in Youth, and I loved it. But anyway, if I thought, here's the topic that would fit me: dealing with abject anonymity and continuing failure. That would be my topic. Because it felt like, for most of my life, I was pretty invisible in terms of ministry. On a broad level. And sometimes I hate it about myself that I have to admit, I need encouragement. When when I do things well, I long to hear, well done. And I don't think I'm the only person that's that way. I think Timothy was that way. I think Paul was pointing to a truth. He was not inventing a principle. He was pointing to a truth that is, it transcends time and culture and people, and good deeds, some good deeds are obvious. And even those that are not obvious can't remain hidden forever. In the same way that some sin is obvious and other sin is not so obvious, but follows along behind, doesn't go away just because it's not obvious. It doesn't even become irrelevant because it's not obvious. Your good deeds. There are certain good deeds that are obvious. I'm going to kind of project this in other directions here, away from myself. But when I see a young adult living well, and I mean following Christ and making good choices, it always gets my attention. I say always, well, it pretty much always gets my attention. And I have a theory that the reason it gets my attention is because their good life is obvious. And they got their good life from somewhere. Somebody discipled them, taught them, disciplined them into a life of making good choices. To me, I feel it's generally obvious somebody had input into that kid's life. I don't even know who that somebody is most of the time. Some of the time, I know the parents and I realize, well, that's where they got that. If you are at a season of your life where your good deeds seem invisible and anonymous, that's okay. You know, that doesn't satisfy my desire to hear, way to go, well done. But the impact of my good deeds has a very long shelf life. In fact, Paul says, even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever. There's going to come a point in time where it will show itself. Now, we have to be very aware, I think, of how, as humans, we're wired. We have this proclivity. We have this tendency, strong tendency, that we want to be noticed when we do something good, and we want to go way under the radar when we do something bad. Well, welcome to the human race if you find that true of yourself. As followers of Christ, we want to do good works because it's part of our nature. Ephesians 2:10 says we are God's workmanship, his craftsmanship, his masterpiece. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works which he prepared in advance for us to do. You see, that is, he created us in Christ to do good works. So when we do good works, we're essentially fulfilling our mission. But why are we doing good works? That's the key. That's the most important question. What's my motive? Is my motive to be noticed? A lot of good can come from people whose motive is to be noticed. I won't deny that. But I will say, for those of us who follow Christ, if my motive is to honor Christ and express his love, that's the highest and noblest of motivations. And so maybe we should kind of take a look in the mirror and decide, what are my motives? Well, See you next time on Soul Care with Stevie.